Hi, I'm Joseph Feraldi. I want to thank you for joining us here at Bayside Chapel online. Our prayer is that today's service will be a blessing to you, that will encourage you in your journey with Jesus Christ, and it will help you to see all that God has in store for you. We would love to hear from you on how God is using this ministry to bless you, and we'd love the opportunity to pray for you. Just send us an email at amen@baysidechapel.org. Remember that you can stay in touch with us at any time. Just visit the App Store and search for our app at Bayside Chapel of NJ. Also, if God is using this ministry to bless you, we'd like to give you the opportunity to partner with us financially. Simply go online to baysidechapel.org or use the Bayside Chapel app and choose whatever option works best for you. Enjoy today's message.
Well, it seems apparent that more and more people are having a hard time controlling their anger these days. Doesn't it seem that way? Consider the case of a fellow by the name of John Justin Baudin, who, when he was 27 years old, living in Minnesota, was arrested for a fifth-degree assault charge for violently losing his temper. And the irony of it all was that when the incident happened, he was on his way to anger management class. He was standing at a bus stop when a 59-year-old woman who was there was accused by Baudin of disrespecting him. And she didn't know what she had done, but he was all in her face about it, and she was feeling pretty threatened, so she got out her phone and started calling 911 when he punched her in the face. Whereupon a 63-year-old man standing nearby tried to intervene, and Baudin hit him with a blue folder that he was carrying, dropped the folder and all the papers in it started scattering, and Baudin ran off. And it was through the papers, his anger management homework, that the police tracked him down because they had his name on it. Now, you might say, in comparison to John Justin Baudin, I don't have an anger problem. But, I think Patrick Morley in his classic book, Man in the Mirror, was probably on target when he wrote these powerful words. He said, anger resides behind the closed doors of most of our homes. Personally, I have never lost my temper at the office. I would never want my colleagues to think I couldn't control myself. But rarely a week goes by in which the sparks of family life don't provide good tinder for a roaring fire of anger. We put on a good show at the office and at our social gatherings, but how you are behind the closed doors of your own personal castle is how you really are. At the end of a long, hard day at the office, when you pull up the drawbridge, your family gets to live with the real you. Anger destroys the quality of our personal lives, marriages, and health. Angry words are like irretrievable arrows released from an archer's bow. Once released, it travels through the air toward the target and cannot be withdrawn. Their damage cannot be undone. Like the arrows of the archer, our angry words pierce like a jagged blade, ripping at the heart of their target. When anger pierces the soul of the home, the lifeblood of the family starts to drain away. Whether you punish those around you by blowing up or by clamming up, before most of us can even begin to teach our children about keeping their cool, we've got to learn to do a better job of it ourselves. There was a researcher who asked children to grade their parents on 12 different aspects of parenting. And, the kids gave their parents A, B, C, or F grades, D or F grades. And they added up the scores. And the moms did pretty well. They got a 3.1 average GPA on those 12 categories, solid B. Dad's just a little worse, 2.98, almost a B. But the one category that really stood out was where 40% of the kids gave their moms and dads C, Ds, or Fs, and the category was controlling his or her temper when I do something that makes him or her angry. That was the worst rating on the whole parental report card. We're looking today at the Book of Proverbs, both as a textbook for how we can teach our children about some of life's most important lessons, but also as an instruction manual for ourselves to help us learn how to more appropriately deal with our own anger. Because kids are much more likely to pay attention to what we teach them if it lines up with the way we live. And so as we saw last week in the book of Proverbs, we frequently encounter this father who represents the voice of wisdom, and he's speaking to his son, passing along these godly nuggets of inspired wisdom. And we're invited to listen in on this conversation as the father urges his son to become wise, and we're invited to apply these God-inspired bits of wisdom to our own lives. Last week we looked at why it's so important that we pursue wisdom as a top priority of life. And today we're getting down to some of the specifics of what it takes to live a wise and godly life. And today we're looking at the specific challenge of keeping our cool. Because when you look at the book of Proverbs, you come to realize that sprinkled throughout, in 30 different places throughout Proverbs, you'll find Proverbs single sayings that deal with our anger. And, what we're going to do today is kind of gather up all those Proverbs that have to do with anger and kind of put them together in a little more systematic of a fashion to kind of organize and present the teaching of Proverbs when it comes to how we deal with our anger. Anger, it's often pointed out, is not necessarily sinful, and that's true. Jesus was angry on a number of occasions, and righteously so. The problem is we're not Jesus. And very often, anger rises up, and you can't stop angry feelings from surfacing. Anger is a natural physiological and emotional response to certain circumstances. You can't stop the angry feelings from surfacing, but what we do with those feelings is where the problems come in. And if we're honest, I think we'll admit that more often than not, we don't handle those angry feelings too well. But there's hope today that we can do better. Wisdom has much to teach us, and God's Spirit has power to change us from the inside out. So today we're going to search through the book of Proverbs and answer to 5 important questions that Proverbs addresses when it comes to dealing with our anger. The first question is, how do I know if I have an anger problem? This is diagnosing the problem. Secondly, why do I have an anger problem? This is getting to the root cause of our anger. It's not good to just treat the symptoms. You got to find out what's really causing those symptoms and treat that. And so we're going to look at the root cause of our anger. And then having figured out the root cause, we're going to ask, how can I overcome my anger? This has to do with treatment. Here's the prescription for how to get better. And then we're going to ask a couple of other questions. How can I deal with anger in the moment? So let's assume that I'm taking my medicine, but I still have these flashes of anger. How can I deal with those angry moments that come up? And then how can I cope when I have an angry person in my life? How do I deal with angry people around me? So let's start with the first question. How do I know that I have an anger problem? It's interesting that as I searched through Proverbs, it seemed to me that when it comes to diagnosing whether I have an anger problem or not, Proverbs is basically encouraging us to ask 3 questions about ourselves as a way of diagnosing our anger. The first question is, are you given to instant displays of annoyance? Are you given to instant displays of annoyance? Proverbs 12, verse 16 says, a fool shows his annoyance at once, but a prudent man overlooks an insult. A fool shows his annoyance at once. An angry fool will react almost immediately to the smallest criticism or annoyance. Do people say of you, well, he flies off the handle, or he's got a short fuse, or he has a low boiling point, or he often flips out? We all know how easily it can happen to us. When you've been up half the night with a cranky baby, and then first thing in the morning, your toddler spills milk all over the kitchen floor. Or, you're watching your kid play baseball, and the ump calls your kid out on a close play at home. How dare he? Or you're driving in rush hour traffic, and somebody cuts you off. Boy, you know how quickly the anger can rise. In fact, the AAA did a survey in which they found that 80% of U.S. drivers express significant anger, aggression, or road rage behind the wheel at least once in the last year. Now, the really scary thing is that 8 million American drivers engaged in extreme examples of road rage, including purposefully ramming another vehicle or getting out of the car and confronting another driver. Now, most of us don't carry it that far, but 80% of us admit to experiencing some anger behind the wheel in the last year. How many of you will admit to experiencing some anger behind the wheel in the last year? Okay, and how many of the rest of you are lying? Proverbs 12:16 says, a fool shows his annoyance at once. You probably have an anger problem if you're given to instant displays of annoyance. Here's the second question you can ask yourself in diagnosing whether you have an anger problem. Have you in anger done something foolish and maybe even sinful? Have you in your anger ended up doing something really foolish or sinful? Proverbs 14:17 says, a quick-tempered man does foolish things. And Proverbs 29:22 says, a hot-tempered one commits many sins. You know how easy it is to do foolish things or even sinful things as a result of out-of-control anger? Cursing at someone, hurling insults, taking God's name in vain, obscene gesturing, defiance of those in authority, verbal abuse, and even physical violence. Lee Strobel says that for the first 5 years of his daughter Allison's life, she only knew a dad who was profane and angry. He talks about remembering how he came home one night and kicked a hole in the wall of the living room just out of anger with life. And he says, I'm ashamed to think of the times Allison hid in her room to get away from me. If people you love go into hiding when you're in one of your moods, you probably have an anger problem. The symptoms of problem anger include displays of instant annoyance when things don't go your way, a track record of doing foolish and even sinful things in your anger. And the third question you need to ask yourself in diagnosing whether you have an anger problem is, do you like getting others worked up? Do you like getting others worked up? Proverbs 29:22 says, an angry man stirs up dissension. If you find yourself surrounded by angry people, it's a good sign that you have an anger problem yourself, because angry people tend to stir up other people to be angry, to be dissatisfied with the way things are. Anger loves company. If I can get you to see things my way and be angry about it too, then I feel justified in hanging on to my angry feelings. But watch out, because those you get worked up may take things a little farther than you want them to go. I love a story that Billy Martin tells in his autobiography, Number One, about a time he went hunting with Mickey Mantle. And Mantle had a friend who had a ranch in Texas where they would often hunt. And so they drove to this ranch, and Mantle walked up to the house while Martin waited in the car, and he asked for permission to hunt. And the owner of the ranch said, well, sure, you can hunt. But Mickey, do me a favor, will you? I've got this pet mule who's going blind, and he needs to be put down. Would you do it for me? And so Mantle said, sure, I'll take care of it. Well, Mickey wanted to play a little joke on his friend Billy, and so he came stomping back to the car, his face red with anger. He said, I can't believe that guy. He won't let us hunt, but I'm going to show him. I'm going to go shoot one of his mules. So he turned on the car and he drove like a madman to the barn. All the while, Martin is saying, Mickey, you can't do that. You can't do that. And Mickey's like, just watch. I'm gonna show that guy. And he drove up to the barn, screeched to a halt, got out, pulled his rifle out of the back seat, went into the barn and shot the mule. And he turned around. As he's getting ready to go back to the car, he hears 2 more shots. He rushes out, and there's Billy Martin standing there, his face red with anger, his gun still smoking. And Mantle says, Billy, what'd you do? He said, I showed that guy. I killed 2 of his cows. Got to be careful when you get other people riled up. They might take it farther than you ever wanted it to go. But look, the point is that if you find that people are around you are always angry, take a look at yourself. It may be that they're catching it from you. Dads, look at your teenage sons. Moms, look at your daughters. Are they angry all the time? Well, some of that may be hormones raging, but could it be that they're getting a lot of their anger from you? Proverbs says angry people typically display their annoyance at things instantly. They end up doing foolish and even sinful things. They tend to draw other people into their anger. Okay, you say, so maybe I have, a few of those symptoms, just a little bit. Let's say that I admit that maybe I've got a little bit of an anger problem. Why? The next question that we need to ask is, why do we have an anger problem? What's at the root of it all? What's the cause? You can't just treat the symptoms. You got to figure out what the root cause is and treat that if you're ever going to get better. And somebody says, well, I know why I'm an angry person. It's in my genes. Why, I'm Irish, or I'm Italian, or I'm Dutch, or just insert your own ethnicity here, because we all tend to blame our failings of character on our ethnicity. Or somebody else says, well, I know why I'm an angry person. I grew up with an angry father. Or I grew up with an angry mother. Or somebody else says, well, I'm angry because of the hand life has dealt me. My life stinks, and I'm angry about it. Or somebody else says, I'm angry because of the people around me are so annoying. I'm angry. My wife makes me angry. It's her fault that I'm angry. The way she disrespects me, or the wife says, it's my husband's fault that I'm so angry, the way he takes me for granted. But as someone has said, other people don't create who you are, they only reveal who you are. Now, none of this is to deny that there are factors that have contributed to your anger problem, but if you're ever going to get to the root of your anger, you have to fundamentally come to the conclusion that your anger at root is a spiritual problem. Your anger at its root is a spiritual problem. Look at Proverbs 14:16. Where it says, a wise man fears the Lord and shuns evil, but a fool is hot-headed and reckless. Do you see the contrast here between the wise man and the foolish man? The man who fears the Lord and the hot-headed man, the one who shuns evil and the one who is reckless. The implication is that a hot-headed person is foolish, and in contrast to the wise man, a fool is someone who doesn't fear the Lord and fails to shun evil. What it boils down to is that if you can't control your anger, something is not right in your walk with God. Erwin Lutzer tells a story about a man from Detroit who went to a men's meeting at his church, but he arrived late. And by the time he got there, God had already been at work in that meeting, and there were a whole bunch of men on their knees repenting of their sin. And this guy, the latecomer, kind of stood in the back of the auditorium, pounding his hand into his fist, or his fist into his other hand, saying, you'll never get me, God. You'll never get me. What was the issue? The issue was that he had a really bad temper and 5 kids, which is not a good combination. And down through the years, he had often wounded the other members of his family, especially his kids, and he knew that if God ever got hold of him, he'd have to go and ask their forgiveness, and he was too proud ever to think of doing so. Anger is one of the clearest manifestations of the sinful flesh. The flesh is simply my way of living independently of God. When I am angry, it's usually when I want to be as God, and people and circumstances aren't cooperating with what I want. And so Paul says in Galatians 5 that strife and fits of anger are among the works of the flesh. In other words, an angry person is not a spirit-filled person, as evidenced by a few other things that point to the fact that he has a spiritual problem. For instance, notice that an angry person lacks patience, according to Proverbs. Proverbs 15:18, a hot-tempered man stirs up dissension, but a patient man calms a quarrel. The patient man here stands in clear contrast with the hot-tempered man. The angry man lacks patience. The angry person lacks wisdom. In Proverbs 14:29, it says, a patient man has great understanding, but a quick-tempered man displays folly. The angry person lacks patience, lacks wisdom. The angry person lacks self-control. Look at Proverbs 29:11, where it says, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. A wise man literally calms it back. This word, keeps himself under control, calms it back, is a word that's used in Psalm 65:7 to refer to calming the waves of the sea. A wise person has the ability to deal calmly with what's bothering him, where the fool is a slave of impulse and shoots off his mouth. He has no self-control. He gives full vent to his anger. So look at these 3 things. If you're taking notes, The angry person lacks patience. The angry person lacks wisdom. The angry person lacks self-control. And over the top of all that, you can say the angry person lacks the fruit of the Spirit, right? Because the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If anger is fundamentally a spiritual problem, because if one's walking in obedience to God and His Word, yielded to the Spirit of God and His work in one's life, the fruit of the Spirit will be seen. But when one is walking in the flesh, living independently of God, then the works of the flesh are going to be seen. Things like strife and dissension and fits of anger. Anger is at its root a spiritual problem. In fact, classically, it's called one of the 7 deadly sins. And Frederick Buechner says of anger, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you're giving back, in many ways is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you're wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. So my anger can't be blamed away on my ethnic heritage, my upbringing, my circumstances, or the annoying people in my life. Fundamentally, my anger is a spiritual problem. When I'm angry, I'm saying in my flesh that the circumstances and the people around me will not sufficiently align with my will. And then that's a spiritual problem if there ever was one. It's saying, I want to be on the throne of the universe instead of God. It's saying that God can't be trusted to make things come out right for me, so I've got to take matters in hand, impose my will on this situation or on these people. At the root of my anger is a spiritual problem that threatens to destroy me and the people around me. So if anger is fundamentally at root a spiritual problem, the next question then is, how can I overcome my anger? How do you treat a spiritual problem? And to put it in the terms of Proverbs, here's the takeaway for the whole morning. It's this one sentence. If you want to keep cool, you've got to grow wise. If you want to keep cool, you've got to grow wise. Look at Proverbs 29:11, where it says, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. Remember, a wise man is not just somebody who's smart. A wise man is somebody who has wisdom. And what is wisdom in the book of Proverbs? Wisdom is skill in godly living. A plus, Chris. The rest of you need to go back to school. Remember, we said that last week. Thumbnail definition of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom is skill in godly living. Wisdom is learning to live life God's way. And so that's why I'm saying if you want to keep cool, you've got to grow wise. Where someone is growing in Christ and the fruit of the Spirit is being produced, that person is growing in wisdom. Anger will be brought under control. A spiritual problem requires a spiritual solution. Anger is about insisting that I be in charge, that I should have my way. Wisdom is about being surrendered to God, letting Him have His way in my life, learning to live life His way, living under His power. So, you remember the story I told you about the man who said, "You'll never get me, God"? Well, eventually God did get hold of him. And the result was that he was convicted that he needed to go back to all 5 of his children and ask forgiveness of them. And the hearts of the whole family were softened as a result. A spiritual problem requires a spiritual solution. If you want to keep cool, you've got to grow wise. You've got to gain skill in godly living. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. You see those three words there? They kind of all overlap in meaning in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom, skill in godly living. Being a person of knowledge is not just having knowledge in your head, but it's having knowledge of God. And understanding is having understanding of God's ways. And look how that all plays into overcoming anger. Proverbs 29:11, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man, one who is skilled in godly living, keeps himself under control. Proverbs 17:27, a man of knowledge, somebody who really knows God, uses words with restraint. And a man of understanding, somebody who really understands how to live life God's way, is even-tempered, literally cool of spirit. So earlier I told you about how Lee Strobel was concerned for his 5-year-old daughter, who only ever knew him as an angry man, went to hide in her bedroom whenever he was in one of his moods. But Lee Strobel was searching, studying the scriptures and trying to make sense of the Christian faith. And finally, through a very detailed and deep study of theology and archaeology and apologetics and the scriptures, came to believe that Jesus is the Christ. And he surrendered his heart and life to Jesus. And here's what he says about the difference Jesus made in his life. 5 months after I gave my life to Jesus Christ, Allison went to my wife and said, "Mommy, I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy." At age 5, what was she saying? She'd never studied the archaeological evidence regarding the truth of the Bible. She didn't know any apologetics. All she knew is that her dad used to be hard to live with, and now he had changed. But more and more, she came to realize that if God does this for people, then sign her up. At age 5, she gave her life to Jesus. God changed my family. God changed my world. God changed my eternity. If you want to keep cool, you've got to grow wise. You've got to become skilled in godly living. And the only way you can become skilled in godly living is if you surrender your heart and life to Christ, if you let God have his way. And you ask him to empower you to live a whole new life in him, producing the fruit of the Spirit. So far we've talked about how we know whether we have an anger problem. We've talked about the root cause of our anger. We've talked about how to keep cool by becoming wise, the treatment. Now I'd like for us to consider a fourth question, that is, how can I deal with anger in the moment? So what's going on here? Well, let's say that I've recognized that my anger is at root a spiritual problem, a sin problem. I've surrendered my life to Christ, and I've asked him to take my anger away, and okay, it's getting better, but I still have those moments, Those moments when my anger just flashes up and when circumstances or people just aggravate me, and before I know it, I've lost control and done something or said something I shouldn't have. Does Proverbs recommend any strategies for dealing with anger in the moment? And I'm happy to report that there are at least 2 strategies that Proverbs recommends for us when we experience those flashes of anger. Here's the first one. Choose to overlook the offense. Choose to overlook the offense. Proverbs 12:16 says, a fool shows his annoyance at once, but a prudent man overlooks an insult. So the fool is immediately annoyed. The angry man is immediately annoyed and shows it. The wise man, feels that annoyance, that anger beginning to flash up, and he hits the pause button. And he makes a choice to overlook the insult. Now, you're not going to be able to do this without the fruit of the Spirit in your life, right? The fruit of the Spirit is patience and self-control. So this is something only somebody who's walking in the Spirit is going to be able to master. But it's a choice we have to make. I feel that anger rising. I feel somebody cuts me off in traffic, and I'm going to honk. I'm going to cut him off. I hit the pause button, and I choose to overlook the offense. Proverbs 19:11 says much the same thing. A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is to his glory to overlook an offense. So oftentimes, when somebody does something to us, they disrespect us, they offend us, they hurt us, they get in our way. our tendency is to want to, retaliate right away. And part of our rationale for doing that is if I don't get back at them, they're not going to respect me. They're going to take advantage of me. But the truth of the matter is when somebody does something stupid to us and we respond in a way that's equally stupid, guess how we look? Now, here's what Proverbs says. It is to a man's glory. It is to a man's beauty. Literally, it is to his adornment to overlook an offense. In other words, if you overlook the offense, somebody does something stupid to you and you're classy enough to rise above it and not respond to it, it really makes you look good. And it pleases the Lord as well. So how can I deal with anger in the moment? Well, the first thing I do is I choose to overlook the offense. And then I decide to leave it with the Lord. I decide to leave it with the Lord. Proverbs 20, verse 22 says, "Do not say, 'I'll pay you back for this wrong.' Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you." It says all over the place in the Bible, God says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. In other words, don't take vengeance into your own hands. You're just going to mess it up and make things worse. Wait for me, and I'll repay that person for what they did to you. I don't have to get even with everyone who puts it to me because my Lord who loves me and cares for me is perfect in his judgment, and he's able to take care of those who wrong me better than I ever could. So choose to overlook the offense and then leave it with the Lord. Now you might say, okay, that's all well and good for people who have real anger problems. That's not my deal. My deal is I live with angry people, at work, at school, at home. It just seems like I've got all these angry people in my life. How can I cope when I have angry people in my life? Well, Proverbs gives you 3 strategies for coping. Let me give them to you briefly. The first is answer an angry person gently. Answer an angry person gently. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So if somebody's in my face getting all angry, and I get all angry back, guess what's going to happen? It just escalates from there. But if somebody's in your face and all angry and you can respond gently, kindly, by the way, gentleness is again part of the fruit of the Spirit. You realize that, right? I can answer gently when somebody is in my face. Man, it just takes kind of all the momentum out of their anger. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So answer an angry person gently. Here's the second strategy. Let him mess up for himself. Let him mess up for himself. Some of you are codependents with angry people. You realize that, don't you? You are enablers. So you've got this angry person in your life who just can't seem to control himself or herself, and they're always getting angry people and doing damage here and doing damage there. And so what do? You're like the alcoholic's wife. You're going around, patching this up and going around making sure this person's okay. Proverbs says, don't do that. Proverbs 19:19, "A hot-tempered man must pay the penalty. If you rescue him, you will have to do it again." If you bail him out and patch things over all the time, you're just going to find yourself doing that over and over and over again, and he'll never learn. Sometimes the only way for an angry person to learn is to experience the consequence of their own anger. Answer an angry person gently, let him mess up for himself, and if possible, avoid his company. If possible, avoid his company. Now, it's not always possible. Sometimes you live with them, and that's not always possible to change, who your family members are. But Proverbs 22, 24, and 25 say, "Do not make friends with a hot-tempered man. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn his ways and get yourself ensnared." So if you have the opportunity, if you have the choice, choose not to associate with the angry person. Now, that's a good summary, I think, of what Proverbs has to say on the topic of anger, but you're saying to yourself, nice talk, Dave, but it's too late for me. I'm gone. I'm an angry person. I've always been an angry person. I'll always be an angry person. There's no change in me. Well, if that's what you think, then you need to know that you've bought into one of Satan's biggest lies. Satan wants you to think that you never can change. Satan wants you to think that you're kind of like the elephant in the old story. You know, there's this big old elephant with a flimsy rope around his ankle, and he's staked in the ground with a flimsy wooden stake. And he's staying, you know, as if, you know, he's stuck. There's nothing he can do, right? He's tied down. Somebody comes along and says to the elephant trainer, how does that flimsy stake and that rope hold that elephant? I mean, that elephant is so big and mighty, he could pull that stake right out of the ground and go wherever he wants. And the trainer says, well, that's true, except for one thing. You see, when elephants are very young, we start them out this way, with a rope around the ankle tied to a stake in the ground. And when they're tiny, they're not strong enough to pull the stake out. They tug on it a time or two or three, and they learn that they can't get themselves free. And so they just decide that, you know, that stake is there to hold them in place, and there's just no getting it out of the ground. And then they grow older and bigger and stronger, but their elephant memory works against them, because they're convinced that they can't pull that stake out of the ground because they remember when. And so they never try. And that's how that flimsy stake and that strand of rope can hold a mighty elephant in place. Some of us, when it comes to our besetting sins, are like that elephant. Someone somewhere a long time ago spoke into our memories, you're an angry person. You're hot-headed. You've got a bad temper. You'll always have a bad temper. And so we've come to believe that lie about ourselves. And especially if you've come to faith in Christ and you're growing in God's grace and growing in maturity, even growing in the fruit of the Spirit, and yet he's still trying to persuade you that stake in the ground, your anger, you're just never going to get free of it. So you just better live with it. But the truth is that Jesus died on the cross at the hands of angry men in order to set us free from all our sin, including our sinful ways of dealing with anger. Amen. The blood of Christ is far more powerful than your anger. He can set you free. You're not doomed always to be a hothead. In Christ, you have the opportunity to become truly wise. As you grow in wisdom, you can learn how to keep your cool. Jesus can change you from the inside out. And as proof of that truth, I want to offer you the testimony of Dr. Ben Carson, one-time presidential candidate, now a cabinet member, who tells a story about how when he was a 14-year-old, he was hanging out at a friend's house and they were listening to music. And there was a song on that Carson really liked, and he was enjoying the song, but his buddy turned the station to a station that was playing a different song, more to his liking. And Carson was kind of ticked, and he turned the station back. And his music began to play again. Well, his buddy immediately turned the station back to his song. And Carson, in a fit of anger, drew out of his pocket a pocket knife he always carried, and in one motion flipped out the blade and lunged at his friend's stomach. By God's grace, that blade hit a big metal belt buckle that his friend was wearing, and it broke off. His friend his face registered horror, thinking that his buddy was so mad he was about to kill him. Carson, realizing what he was done, was stricken with remorse. And he apologized to his friend and said, I'm sorry. And he dropped the blade and he ran out of the house, ran all the way home. The house was empty at the time. But here's what Carson says happened in those next moments. I burst into our empty house, locked myself in the bathroom, and sank to the floor, miserable and frightened. I could no longer deny that I had a severe anger problem and that I had never achieved my dream of being a doctor with an uncontrollable temper. I admitted to myself there was no way I could control myself. But, Lord, please, you've got to help me, I prayed. Take this temper away. You promised that if I ask anything in faith, you'll do it. I believe you can change me. I slipped out and got a Bible, and came back and locked the door. I opened to the book of Proverbs, and the words of Proverbs 16:32 convicted me, but also gave me hope. It said, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." I felt God telling me that although he knew everything about me, he still loved me. And because he made me, he was the only one who could change me, and that he would. Gradually, I stopped crying. My hands quit shaking, and I was filled with the assurance that God had answered my prayer. Now here's Ben Carson's testimony. He says, "Uncontrolled anger has never again been a threat to me or those around me. God has provided and will provide whatever strength I need to control my anger." Friends, here's the good news today. If you are a follower of Jesus, you don't need to stay an angry person. Who the Son sets free, he is free indeed. If you're a child of God today, say, "Yes, I am."
Yes, I am.
And if you're a child of God and you want to be done with anger, ask him right now, right here, in this moment, to set you free. Let's stand together and sing.